Welcome to the Authentic Cinema Podcast. I'm Bob Lyron, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Mike Barron. Mike, how's it going?
Oh, it's going well. Well, it's going, isn't it?
Yeah, it is going. I thought like right off the top, we should point out it's been a while since we recorded.
We have.
It's been, I don't know, like over a month since we recorded an episode. And
at least.
Part of the reason, a big part of that reason was Major League Baseball postseason was going on. We both love postseason baseball.
Particularly postseason, yeah, definitely.
We were both glued to the entire postseason. I mean, I'm a Guardians fan. Mike's a Dodgers fan. And the Guardians played the Yankees. And then, of course, the Yankees and the Dodgers got together in the World Series. During the World Series, we had a couple of great conversations. And then I was like, you know what? I think that we're going to have to launch a new podcast. It's going to be the Authentic Baseball Podcast. But here's the catch, Mike. We're only going to do it for the postseason.
Yeah, I think, and listeners, I don't think I've ever mentioned this, but I'm actually like a rabid soccer fan, crazy soccer fan. But every October, I take a little vacation. I call it like my side sport. It's like I go I fall back in love with baseball, and I get into the postseason. I usually get into no matter what. It's always better. This season, I think, was special because we both had a horse in the race.
Keep an eye out October 2025 for the Authentic Baseball Podcast. But today we're back. We're back in the booth, as you like to say. We're back to record to talk about a film that you picked, which is a 2009 French film called Prophet. And before we get into why you picked it, I just wanted to say one thing about this film, which is this film, I'm the kind of person, film is incorporated into my daily life, whether I'm watching a film, reading about films. So, but there's always like a huge laundry list of movies that I never saw, but I remember at one point reading about or hearing about. And I think that A Prophet was one of those films, because when you picked it, when you told me the film you picked, I'm like, I think I know that film. How did you discover A Prophet? Like, when did you hear about it, or when did you first see it?
Oh, great question. I think I heard about, I don't remember exactly when I saw it the first time, but my wife is French. And before she moved to Los Angeles, she had been an actress in Paris.
Oh, wow.
And knows, she's very much was, in the theater scene. And then through that and through the school she went to, knew a lot of people that were in the film scene too. She actually knows a lot of actors and actresses that are fairly famous French actors now.
Sure.
And I remember it was early in our relationship. I think we were living in downtown LA, and she recommended, she's like, you should see this film called A Prophet, Un Prophète. In Paris, it was a big deal. Like when it came out in France, it really made like a big splash.
When you did watch, what made you think of it for this conversation, for this podcast?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I would tell you that I think when I had told you my selection that I was going to go with this film, this all started because when I was in France this summer, we talked and you said, okay, your next pick needs to be a French film. So I was like, okay, I'll pick a French film. And you could do, I'm a huge Francois Truffaut fan. We could have done a Godard. There's a lot. I mean, the French, it just goes on and on. They're just a major cinematic player,
Yeah.
But this film, I have to tell you, I selected it first and foremost. This film, I think I told you, it's really one of those films I saw that left me truly kind of at the end of the film, I was just sort of astonished. I was just like, wow.
That's a great word.
Yeah, I did. It actually, at the end of the film, the last shot, as they're walking away from the prison in the cars, he's walking with Riyadh's.
Yeah, with his buddy's wife. Yeah.
Wife and the baby, and they're walking, and they decide to walk for a while, and then the trucks come in behind them, and
like this convoy.
That, yeah, he has a convoy behind him, and I remember thinking like, wow, like that's really, it all sort of hit me what happened in this film. It's also a peek into a culture, I think, that doesn't get revealed very often. This this French Arabic culture, which we can get into if we want to a little bit later. It was a side of France that I didn't know about, to be honest. I think it's a profoundly honest film. I think it's a very, very honest film. I think it's a film in line with all the other films that we've chosen. It doesn't give you any easy answers, like it's very complex. The relationships are complex. And then I would say that sort of, if you wanted to look at this through some kind of moral or ethical lens, it's very complicated, But I think
definitely
what ultimately made me want to talk about this film is all those reasons. Another big reason, before I go to my big one, the actor Tahar Rahim, that is absolutely probably the in my top 3 performances of all time by an actor. I think at its core, it's a film essentially, or what spoke to me, okay, is I think it's actually a film about the soul, about the soul. And that's, I think, linked to why it's called a prophet.
For me, there was like a lot about the craft of making this film that really impressed me. The director, his name is Jacques
Audiard. The D would be silent, so it's Audiard.
Okay.
Audiard. My wife is laughing right now. In the future,
Audiard. A fan. I mean, just
Audiard.
A tremendous effort. Yeah, tremendous effort by him, and like he really did something special with the material and the way that he presented it. But we were joking before the podcast started. We were like, we have to be careful not to get bogged down with the plot because it's just because it's the plot is.
It is definitely a very complex plot, and like we were saying, I've watched it 3 times, and I've had the same feeling you did. I was like, I don't know if I can just give a recap of all because it's a film in a large part about all these like kind of intricate and complex relationships between these kind of these power groups, and so there are a lot. I think we can both say pretty confidently, this is an epic film. I mean, it's really an epic, and it's kind of a hidden epic in the sense that you're in a prison the whole time, but the cast of characters is huge, and the kind of relationships and links between these kind of powerful groups, it's very difficult, especially since it's in a foreign language that we don't speak. It's hard to keep track of everything, but like we said in the conversation before the pod, like it's not, for the purposes of this podcast, like I don't think it's certainly important to the film. It's a part of the dynamic of the film, but like I don't think we need to do a rehash of this plot anyway, beyond just sort of the basic, kind of plot points.
So before we get there and before we kind of dive into the film, there is a question I wanted to ask you, which is on our last episode, when we talked about No Country for Old Men, we spent a lot of time, and this is something that I've expressed over several episodes, is this idea of like authenticity in genre.
Right.
And in genre film, how filmmakers are able to create this authentic film. And one of the things we boiled it down to is that when you have these really talented directors, when you make a genre film, it confines the filmmaker in a way that they have to follow certain rules or ideas that conform to this genre. And we all know that with really talented creative people, sometimes confining them really liberates them to work within walls as opposed to just giving them a complete blank slate. Now, some people might want to argue that A Prophet is a genre film, but for me, that thought never crossed my mind. In other words, I didn't think to myself, I'm watching a prison movie or I'm watching a gangster film. This is not what I would categorize as a genre film.
Well, I think like all authentic films, like it definitely doesn't fit into a neat and tidy box. That's like my tagline.
Right.
I say that about every film, but it doesn't. Like it does not fit itself into a neat and tidy box. On the surface, you would look at this and go, okay, it's a prison film. It's about being in prison, and that you wouldn't be wrong, of course. But there's so much more to it. To me, it's a film that is more about kind of. I was thinking about it at one point. I was like, it's kind of a prison breakout movie in a way, but not in the traditional sense. It's more well, I was saying this. It's not a breakout. It's not an escape film. It's not a prison escape film where like Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah, it's not The Great Escape, right?
Right, or The Great Escape, a good example, or Papillon. No, you pretty much know in the film he's gonna do his whole sentence. And but it is a film about liberation, I think, and so that's interesting because it's a film about liberation, but also not like your traditional genre escape from prison film, you know. In fact, he's given those
furloughs,
the furlough days where he's allowed, you know, for 12 hours to go out into the world. And I wanted to talk about those days. But you always know he's coming back. Like, he's desperate. You know, part of the tension of those furlough scenes is that, you know, he's actually not trying to escape. He's trying to consolidate power within the prison, actually, and outside of it.
It's funny that you brought up that you just said a really important word for me for this discussion, which is tension. And I think that one of the things I latched onto after watching this film a couple times, and just if I could talk to the director, I would just say, like, dude, like, your ability to build tension and maintain tension in this film is unlike. I mean, maybe once or twice I've seen other films that were different in scope that had a level of tension that a Prophet has, but it's really from the jump off, like from the opening scene of the film, when it's just like you're literally just dropped in to just an absolute chaotic, scary, tense-filled environment. And then we'll get to the main character Malik in a minute, but I thought that it was just sort of a point worth making, that like this director, he establishes a level of, because creating tension in film, that's not easy. Okay. It's like, if it doesn't translate, it's you flop. Okay. Like the scenes, and it's not tense because we're putting people in these really extenuating circumstances. It's a tension actually because the conversations that are being had, and like the confinements of being in a very small room, and, you know, the threat of violence. And the director does a great job literally from the jump off of just showing, like, this is not a place you want to be. Okay. We're not glamorizing prison here. This is a very scary, tense environment that essentially he upholds it throughout the whole film.
I think you're touching on something, which is, you're right. The tension in the film is this sort of pervasive, chronic. It comes from the environment itself. I mean, it's really an environment where there is really no sense of real safety. And as an audience member, you're watching it and it's really uncomfortable all the time. And it's such a dangerous environment. It's a dangerous world. You know me, I'm always sort of obsessed with the world of a film, and the world of this film is incredible. Like, it's this prison world. Even when he's out in the quote unquote real world, he's still in that prison world. He's still sort of contained within that prison world.
So one of the things I'm interested in talking about is the opening scene, because it's really interesting the way that we meet Malik in his processing. After he arrives at the prison, they have to process him. And that's a really crucial scene for kind of setting up who Malik is and who he is in this world.
Right.
Essentially, he has to go, he has to answer questions. And the questions are kind of like formalities, but we learn a lot about Malik. And you said something interesting, which is, it's like he's like a blank slate.
He's a completely blank slate. Yeah.
He's a completely blank slate. Like, and so I just wanted to know what you thought about that in terms of like its meaning for the rest of the film.
What I really should say is this is definitely one of those education of a criminal kind of movies, right? Like it's I was going to say that one of the reasons I selected the film is because it's the most incredible character arc I've ever seen in a film before. Like, it's just where he starts out at the beginning of the film and where he ends up at the end of the film. I mean, if you want to talk about an arc, like, it's incredible. He doesn't belong to anyone. In the beginning, that is a real vulnerability. Like, he's not protected by anybody. Like, he has no protection. So there's that. He's this complete blank slate. But what's fascinating is by the end of the movie, that's actually what gives him all his power, is that he belongs to himself. This is a film about a guy who essentially, in an incredibly disciplined way, like, builds himself, makes himself essentially in the prison, and then liberates himself. You kind of have to understand Arabic-French relations a lot. I think it could be seen as a commentary on Franco-Arab kind of existence. And by that, I mean, there's a whole sort of feeling in France that you have these people of Arab descent that are born in France, but are neither accepted neither by the French nor the sort of native Islamic population or Muslim population, or Arabic population. They're sort of, they exist in this space in between. This is also a great examination, I think, of power, this film. Like how power, the dynamics of power. And in the beginning of the film, he's this blank slate and he has absolutely no power, to the point that he's actually forced to commit a murder that he doesn't want to commit, a very disturbing murder that he doesn't want to commit. And it's going through that process of being completely powerless and sort of this promise that he makes essentially to himself to kind of never be in that situation again. He sort of, after this murder, and why I think we see him living with the ghost of Rayeb, the man he murders, is that his soul basically has been essentially almost taken away from him, right? And he vows, like, essentially, it's never explicitly stated, right, in the film, but I think this is a guy who is going to very slowly, like, make sure he's in a position where no one can ever do that to him ever again. He's going to slowly and in a very disciplined manner take control of what I think in the beginning is himself. And then by extension, because the only way within that prison environment he can take control of himself is he's got to take control of the prison.
You brought up the killing, the murder that happens. He's forced to commit a murder. And that's a really interesting scene. There's an authenticity and a realness to it that is seldom kind of captured on film. Cutting someone's jugular with a straight razor is horrific, and it's not presented as glamorous or in any way enlightening. It's a terrible, terrible thing that happens to Malik, and we are forced to watch it. And I think that speaks to something that I really love about this film, which is the style in which it was made, which is the film's, a lot of the film is shot like in a handheld way.
Yeah.
The camera is very fluid and you're always confined. Obviously we're in a prison, and the filmmaker does a fantastic job of making you feel confined, which adds to that layer of tension. But the interesting thing about that scene is that this guy, Rayeb, is kind of nice to him at the beginning of the scene.
I was just going to bring that up.
We should point out that, like, the reason for the meeting is because Malik has agreed under false pretenses to go to the room to trade sexual favors for drugs. And that's how he kind of gets into the room. It's a very tense thing for Malik, but for Rayeb, it's kind of like, hey, let's sit down and talk for a minute. Let me make you a coffee. Let's relax a little bit. And
that's what throws everything off, right? He goes into that prison cell with Rayeb, thinking that he's just going to be, again, exploited, like the Corsicans are exploiting him and telling him, like, you're going to go in there, you're going to give him a blowjob, and then you're going to slit his throat, basically, right? Which, talk about just the levels of dehumanization that are going on there, right? The way he's being used. And then we, I think, as the audience, are expecting that when he arrives in that cell, he's just going to be, like, again, sort of sexually exploited right away, right? And it even begins, like, he brings him in and he locks the door and he searches him and he says, and Rayeb says, like, I'm going to be the one calling the shots, right? And he's like, okay, and so you, even up to that point, you're like, God, this guy's like, oh God, this is going to be another horrible moment of trauma, and it is, but not the way you think. And then all of a sudden, just to touch on what you're saying, you're right. He's actually very kind to him. He says, no, let's sit down for a minute. Do you want a coffee?
Yeah, do you like to read books?
Do you like to read books? Oh, you can't read. And then he says something to him that is very important and informs the rest of the film, which he says something to the idea is to leave here smarter than when you came, a little smarter than when you came in. And that, to me, in a film called A Prophet, that is the prophecy. The prophecy is the murder. Like, all the things that kind of happen after that are directly related to him. The secret, the idea is to come out of here smarter than before, than when you came in.
I think if he's going to evolve, as these opportunities after that scene, and when Malik's journey kind of begins after this murder is like you said, not only is it a process of self-discovery and evolution by Malik himself, but also like his environment. And I think that what Rayeb did for him was he sort of just like lit the fuse for like, okay, or shined a light on, so to speak. Yeah, the flame, exactly.
Well, he's the first person, if you think about it, he's the first person in the entire film up to that point who actually is sort of kind to him.
Yeah, and treats him like a human being.
And treats him like a human being.
Throughout the rest of the film, of course, Malik has Rieb. He appears to Malik. He's in his room with him, and Malik actually ends up having conversations with him.
Yeah.
A big part of these appearances, these sort of supernatural style appearances of this dead guy, is that he's often educating him in little subtle ways along the way. Like, you need to pay attention to this, or you need to always have a big picture view, or, he just kind of serves them almost as like a mentor to him in death.
Right.
And if we're talking about the journey of a prophet, I guess, then that certainly the presence of the ghost of Rieb is going to be an important part of that.
It's really interesting, right? And that's why I love this. It's one of the things I just really, hit me about this movie, is it does have this kind of, I don't even like the word supernatural. It's more of really. It's more of a mystical, right? Like a mystical kind of mysterious, spiritual, not spiritual like New Age, but spiritual like religious kind of mystical.
Well, he has visions throughout the film too.
These mystical visions of the guy he murdered, who's then his kind of essentially like guiding him, a guide, basically a spiritual guide, right? This could help us talk about what we were talking about earlier with he's a blank slate. And I was thinking about this film like, okay, a prophet. Is Malik the prophet? I mean, I think he probably, he is. I think you could say he is, in the sense that, but I was thinking about the story of Moses, right? And Moses was like placed in a basket, right? And then sent down this river Jordan, and then they brought him out of the river, and he was taken in by the Egyptians, right? And then, but he's Jewish, and he ends up, living and becoming like essentially almost brothers with the Egyptians, who are subjugating his people, right?
Right.
And I think that there's, it's funny that I'm looking at a Jewish prophet in a Muslim film, although that's all Abrahamic. But like, so Moses is enslaved, but then leads the Jewish people to freedom. What's interesting, though, is, again, you have this kind of, he doesn't really fit with the Jewish people, right? Because he's been raised by the Egyptians, but he's not really an Egyptian either, right? Because he's Jewish, right? But he ends up being able to save his people because he speaks both languages. Right, he's able to speak both languages, and not just
which
languages,
is a big part, a big plot point in the prophet, and a prophet is like his ability to communicate with all these different people.
He's a bridge. He can communicate with people that cannot communicate with each other, basically. Right. Like, and then that's how Malik consolidates all of his power. Basically, is because he can communicate. He is this bridge of communication, and therefore what can he do? He realizes he can control the communication. And if you control the communication in the prison, then you have all the power, basically.
Well, I think that it speaks to this idea that, like, in this, as you pointed out at the beginning, we've got like a group of Corsican mobsters, and we've got a Muslim brotherhood, and then we have like a prison system. And as he is like the bridge between these groups, when you're the bridge, and I know one of the things you really liked about the film, and one of the things I really liked about the film, is every time Malik has an opportunity, when someone says, "Are you working for the Corsicans?" He's like, "No, I work for myself." Are you working with them? Are you with the Muslims? No, I work for myself. It's a reoccurring thing that he says. And I think that when you're in the position that Malik's in, it's almost like, well, the Corsicans have their own MO. They have their own thing that they're doing, and they're going to make decisions and do things that are going to have consequences, but it doesn't necessarily affect me because I'm just a mouthpiece. Okay. And so, and then the same thing for the other side, for the Muslims and the Arabs in the film, they also have their own kind of thing going on with their faction. And what he's able to do as he becomes more educated and liberated within himself, he's able to kind of manipulate those things to his own advantage, but it's not like a Machiavellian thing. I mean, it does by the end. It gets pretty intense, but for the most part,
against the Corsicans. I think it is like a Machiavellian towards the Corsicans more than the Muslims. Although,
but it's also that's based on like this idea that the way that he was treated by them and the way that he was manipulated by them.
Well, that's where I think it's a revenge film. He's actually, what he's doing, you could also argue throughout the whole film, not to get us too off because I have stuff to say also, but he's taking slow revenge for Rayeb, the man he kills, basically.
Right.
It's like he's slowly and in this disciplined manner and using essentially the principles that Rayeb imparts to him very quickly before he murders him, about becoming smarter, learning to read, that's the secret. The education is the secret, right?
Right.
He slowly, methodically, and very disciplined way enacts revenge on Caesar at the end.
It was funny when I watched the film for the first time, and of course, like anybody that watches this film, they're gonna be like, okay, what's a prophet? And so I actually, when I watched it, I loved it, but I also like did a little bit of like a heavy sigh, and I'm like, oh man, am I gonna have to like start educating myself on prophets now? And so
a little bit,
a little bit. So I went online and I started doing a little bit of reading, because ultimately what I liked about it was I'm like, well, just, I don't want to call it common sense, but let's just call it common experience. I'm like, prophet, like Muhammad, like Moses, like Jesus, and I'm like, but this isn't that kind of guy. So then I thought, well, let me do a little bit of research. And one interesting thing I learned was that there's actually, in the Nation of Islam, or in the Quran, maybe, they talk about this idea of prophets, but then there's also this thing called a prophetic messenger. Right. And a prophetic messenger is a person that speaks and spreads the word of God. But a prophet is just someone that enables those qualities and acts in a prophetic way. Okay. And actually I don't know what religious text or which religion specifically it said, but they're saying, well, there could be as many as 250,000 prophets in human history. And when I read that, I'm like, okay, that now I can kind of wrap my head around how Malik could be included in that group of prophets. In other words, you're not necessarily like, you share things in common with the prophetic messengers, but you're not on a mission of God, so to speak.
Well, I think, this is a real interesting question, right? And I don't think this film answers this question for you, right? At the end of the film, right. He liberates himself, but he becomes a criminal overlord, right?
Right.
But he also kind of orchestrates the Arab dominance of the prison as well, right? He essentially delivers, quote unquote, his people from bondage from the Corsicans, basically.
That's true. Yes.
And also, I was also doing some research on it as well, and prophets unite different tribes. They bring groups together. But I do think, in the context of this, is why I brought up Moses too, is that Moses, in a sense, didn't belong to anybody either, in a way, or it belonged in this liminal space in between, and then was able, by essentially being educated by the enslavers, was able to liberate his own people, basically.
I think I'm comfortable saying to myself, one of the reasons this film is so amazing is that it's telling this parallel prophet story in the confines of a modern day prison
right.
with dueling tribes. What an achievement. It's amazing that the director was able to do this. It's just like, it's really kind of
well, it sets it up in like a microcosm, right? You have this great microcosm, which again, I think to fully understand this film, you have to understand kind of the Franco-Arabic, a little bit about Franco-Arabic relations and stuff like that.
Let me interject really quickly on that. Like you shared a really great article, which we'll link in the description for the episode. It was a New York Times article basically talking about the history of French-Arab relations within France. And I'm just going to say one thing about it, and then you know more about it than I do. But really, my takeaway from the article was that they have a crisis in France, a cultural crisis where children and young adults or even adults that are of Arab descent, but born in
Arab France.
In France. So they're French citizens, but born of Arab descent, almost are like people without a state. They don't have, they're like, as you said, they're not accepted culturally or in the eyes of the people of France as being French. And Arabs around the world would not consider them true Arabs because they were born and raised in a Western culture like France.
And they're really cut off. They're cut off from the actual traditions, really.
And it is a mountain of a topic, but almost like when we talked about zone of interest, like we're going to like start to try to break down the Holocaust here. Like it's a huge undertaking, but within the confines of this film, it plays a really interesting role.
And then another big problem, and it is touched on a little bit in this film, is that French society essentially segregates them and puts them in these places. We would call them projects, but they're called banlieue, and they're big projects on the outskirts of. In this article, it's called the Other Paris, on the outskirts of Paris, and they're really not given a lot of opportunities, real opportunities to enter the job force, and. So this article in particular, we should specify, is looking at whether or not the banlieues it's in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. And so it's looking at it in the sense of like, are these breeding grounds of extremism and terrorism? Because there's such a lack of opportunity that the sort of kind of doxa, I guess, the accept is like, oh, these are breeding grounds for like extremists. And what's great about the article is George Packer goes in and lives with them, and it's actually not that simple. Like, there is a lot of resentment, there is a lot of problems, and there have been people that went on to do terrible things. But really, it's just more about just not being accepted by French society, not being let into French society. And my wife said something interesting the other night when we were talking about this, and she said, the problem is that these are two different cultures that really don't fit together very well.
I think that it presents an interesting platform for Malik to navigate, because that what's represented by this grander idea of what's going on in France between the French and Arab culture clash and the segregation and everything that comes along with that very real thing that's happening in France is also a big part of how Malik has to navigate this world within the prison. And it's very scary, and it adds a lot to that tension that we were talking about. Is like he's openly spoken down to and called a dog by the Corsicans while he's making them coffee, and he's physically threatened by Arab prisoners when he walks down the wrong hallway to return some books. And it's just it's a chaotic, it just adds to the level of confusion and chaos in the film. And so one of the things I really like about this film is how, and this has as much to do with Tahar Rahim, who plays Malik, is his ability to translate that with his face. Is that you spoke earlier about just like, this might be one of the top 3 acting performances you've ever seen in a film. And I think that that's no exaggeration, is that so much of what we see and feel as a viewer, because we go through the film with Malik. This is, we've talked about this in other podcasts, I think, when we say there's kind of like 2 overreaching types of films. There's films where the viewer knows more than the main character, and then there's films where the viewer is learning things at the same time as the main character. Yes. And this is the second. This is like, we are every step of the way.
We're with
when Malik learns something, we learn it with him.
And we have no more information than he has, right? We don't know anything that he doesn't know.
Right. And so when I was watching the film, I remember I thought to myself, one of the reasons I love this film so much is I have no idea what's going to happen next. Yeah. Okay? I have no idea where this is going. Like, anything could happen, and I cannot predict where this story is going to go. But if you think about it from the main character, Malik's point of view, that's absolutely terrifying. Okay. Like, and you see that in the performance by Rahim, which is like, he is able to translate that. I'm terrified, but I can't show it. I have little facial tics when I'm talking to the Corsican boss, César, who is an absolute psychopath and a terrible human being. But that guy, César, massages his relationship with Malik, and he almost gouges his eyeball out with a spoon. But then in the next scene, he's like, "Come over and sit next to me." I mean, it's terrifying, and it's terrifying for the character of Malik. Yeah. And it's one of the wonderful things about this film and the filmmaker to be able to capture that.
Part of the game that Malik is playing with Caesar is they're using each other, I guess, in a way, right? He's learning from Caesar like how to run a criminal empire,
Yes.
Right. But he cannot, he can't give away that he's doing that, the whole time. And that was just so astonishing at the end of this film. It's like this little feral, totally vulnerable, young Arabic kid who's completely vulnerable by the end of the film, and then completely at the mercy and exploitation of this all-powerful Caesar, and the name is not a mistake, obviously, Caesar character. At the end, Caesar is rendered completely powerless, completely vulnerable, completely, they switch, basically, by the end of the film. It's astonishing. It's really astonishing. And the thing about it is it's not cheesy. It earns all of that, all of that is just meticulously, methodically earned.
One of the interesting things I wanted to bring up, which I noticed, every time I watched it was, and it kind of plays off power, is the role that shoes play in this film. I'm getting pretty micro here, but there's an important scene right at the beginning of the film when Malik is in the prison yard, and we've pointed it out, he knows no one, he has no protection, and he basically gets jumped by these two inmates, and they steal his shoes, and it's a terrible feeling for Malik to have lost his shoes, because it basically shows that you're just completely weak. You have no power here. We can just walk up to you and take your shoes. But throughout the film, shoes, at least in two other moments, they play a big role. And the second moment is when Malik starts to gain favor with the Corsicans and he starts to make money. One of the things he does is he goes and buys a nice pair of prison shoes.
Yeah.
Okay. And he sits in his cell and he's kind of admiring the shoes. And then there's a really crucial moment at the end of the film when Malik is making his big play, his big chess move. And we won't get bogged down in the details, but he's basically going to assassinate a bunch of bodyguards, and it's a plot point with an Italian mobster. Right before he does it, the film slows down, and Malik time stops for him, and he's on like some super, I don't know France, I don't know Paris, but he's on some super rich street with all these designer stores, and he glances at this shoe display of like Chanel and Louis Vuitton shoes or whatever, and he kind of just looks at him for a moment, and it's almost, I had this idea that like he's that close. He knows, he's like, I am so close to getting this. Okay. Yeah. And then he goes in and then has this like crazy shootout in a car. And there's another moment where like the camera slows down and it shows like this euphoric face that he has. Like he's realized like, I'm going to do it. I'm actually going to do what I want to do. And I think that it's interesting how Audiard kind of use shoes not only as like a representation of like how he loses power, but how he attains to get it back. And then when he almost has it.
Yeah. Yes. One thing I want to comment, I just thought of when you said that, is this is another example because Caesar is basically hired him again to go kill this. It's Caesar's own boss, Jackie Marcaggi. Right. And here, I'm just saying, like, you have another assassination and then he ends up not killing the guy instead. Mm-hmm. And that's what gives him the power. In the beginning, he's forced to kill this guy. In this instant, he kills the bodyguards, but he actually doesn't kill the target. And it's also, I think, a message of like, he's really taking control, and he gives Marcaggi his life as well. And then it's
almost like in a prophetic way, what we were talking about before about being a bridge and being able to like navigate these worlds. And like, you don't necessarily have to follow the rules of this mob. These guys are focused on this assassination, and their mistake is thinking that they can control Malik and force him to do things. But the real power is Malik's ability to not do what they want me to do, to twist it and turn it on its head for my own, I say my own benefit, but for what he wants to happen.
And they underestimate the network that he puts together. Right?
They underestimate him because he has no identity. They view him as a dog. Yeah, they view him as nothing.
They can't imagine that he would, be able to put together the sort of network that he puts together. And it's, and I think to a certain degree, I think at the beginning of the film, we can't imagine that either. And then at the end of the film, like, you're just like, oh, wow. Remember when I recommended this film and I told you about the book. This is kind of random, but it's not. The book that I sent you years ago by Robert Caro about Lyndon Johnson.
Oh yeah,
and
Path to Power.
The Path to Power, which I actually think has a lot of similarities, to be honest, thematically. I mean, it's a true story. The Path to Power.
I just think that it's about power.
It's about the dynamics of power.
Yeah.
And what does Lyndon Johnson?
Right.
Yeah. So the chapter in particular that really struck me is when Lyndon Johnson goes to college, right? And he starts out and he's a total fucking loser and he doesn't fit in with anybody. And then I'll skip over it, but he slowly he starts his own club, and then he but he also connects himself to the college president, remember, becomes indispensable to him. And then by the end of that chapter, which is also one of the most astonishing things I've ever read, it becomes clear that when he was a senior in college, he was literally running the university. He was running the whole college because he had basically had control over the college president and everybody. He controlled every facet of the college by the time he left. Right. And it reminded me, this film, A Prophet, reminded me of that. And if you study Lyndon Johnson, but it's all about networks of communication, right? Connections, controlling the networks of communication, controlling the information and how it is distributed across, and what people know and what they don't know, right? And controlling access, is a big deal. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think one of the things that made me think about was this idea of acquiring power, maintaining power, and wielding that power. It's really one of the most intimidating and fascinating human characteristics. And as groups, as tribes, as cultures, as countries, as prison systems, the way that power is used to manipulate people, to hurt people, and to profit people it's a really scary kind of thing. And I think that, whether it's a fictional character in a 2009 French film or a very real story about a president, you can see these underlying themes, and they're both fascinating and alarming, of the way that power works.
And I would say that this story is essentially, at its core, it's a story about how a man empowers himself in the most extreme circumstances.
We've talked a lot about when we talk about the films on this podcast, we talk about layers, and about how really authentic cinema, authentic films, they not only entertain you and they tell great stories, and they're really kind of like the apex of the art, but also the whole point of being authentic is there's a lot more going on than what you just see at the surface.
I was reading about the Prophet Muhammad, and the Prophet Muhammad, and how he was visited by the angel Jibril, which is Gabriel in the Jewish Christian tradition.
Yeah, they talk about it in the film.
Yeah, and how the character of Rahab, in a sense, could be seen. The guy that's assassinated could be seen in that kind of angelic. He's delivering the message of absolutely Malik's empowerment, we could say, or Malik's liberation, Malik's soul.
I hesitate to ask because I don't want to throw you out there without a lifeline, because I don't really understand it, but I was hoping you could enlighten me a little bit. What is your take on, as the scenes with Rahab appearing, he's covered in flames.
Yeah, he's on fire. Yeah.
He's on fire. And I was like, what is that? Why is he on fire?
I think initially my thought is that the flame, think of the burning bush with Moses, right? It's this spiritual flame. I think the flame, it's his, it's like his soul flame, in Christianity, right? The Holy Spirit, is
it's almost like in the afterlife, you have this holy flame.
Well, I think, but it also has this flame, this illumination as well, right? Flame illuminates. And I think in the context of this film, it's not this he's in hell and he's on fire. I think, no, it's more of that Moses burning bush kind of. And the first time we see the flame is on the tip of his finger. Remember, 1 year later, he's sitting
on his birthday.
That's my favorite image, by the way, in the entire film. Actually, that image. That's when I remember watching this the first time. I was like, oh shit, I'm into this now. That is such a just profound. And it's where you also realize, like, wow, I'm not just watching like a gritty, prison film. I am, but like this is going to go expand beyond that into much deeper kind of spiritual territory. He has to like make the death of Rahab mean something, right? Like it can't just be this victim. If he just surrenders and becomes this victim, then he'll lose his soul. But if he can take the sacrifice basically of Rahab's death and make it mean something, then he can redeem Rahab and can redeem himself, I think.
You and I have made films. We've made films together. We've made our own little projects and small projects and big projects. And we both know, and anyone that's made films knows, it's incredibly difficult to do. It's not easy. And in fact, Martin Scorsese has a really famous quote where he's like, everything on a film is hard. Simple is hard. And when I watch a film like A Prophet, I'm just in awe of the filmmaker and his ability to deliver something so amazing, because it is so layered. It is, but also it's entertaining. Like we were saying, like this is it has a genre, sprinklings of genre, but it's a very tense film. It keeps you kind of on the edge of your seat. Like I said earlier, I had no idea what was going to happen. I was fully engaged. I'm fully engaged with the characters. I'm looking at the effort by Tahar Rahim and his acting performance. Everything is landing for me. And so when I was done watching it, I was just like, man, what an amazing achievement. Okay. And then to add in, like, if you just say, even if you took half of the things that we talked about in this podcast, okay, the themes and the ideas and what they might represent and what they made us think about or made us feel, it's amazing that he was able to go out and do it. And it's something that I always admire about the films we talk about.
Sure. And I think a good way to maybe conclude this podcast, if you're ready, we don't have to, but is to talk about, you brought up a really interesting question the other night. We were talking about it and you were like, the ending of the film, like if he's a prophet, what is he a prophet of? Is it possible, because he gets out and he's running a criminal empire. If you're invested in Malik, which I mean, it's his story.
How could you not be if you watch this film, right?
Well, it's really profound because he's actually thrown a revolution and like liberated himself from his bondage,
When I was thinking about prophets and like I joked earlier about having to do a deep dive on prophets, and I think that one of the things that I was thinking about, which I think makes the film so fascinating, is what just my baseline idea of what a prophet is versus what impact prophets or these prophetic messengers had on their time. And it's not black and white, like, well, this guy came and liberated these people. Like there was a different perception at that time of who that individual was. We have the luxury of history to look back on these seismic events in human history and these individuals that had an impact. But at the time, it was not perceived the same way. Okay. And even in the immediate aftermath of these events in human history. And I think that one of the cool things about this film, by framing it in a prison story about a blank slate man with no nation, and to watch his story unfold, is that I thought to myself, this actually probably has a lot more in common with how things would work with a prophet, which is this isn't necessarily viewed by everyone as the best thing that could have happened to these people at that time. And this isn't necessarily the right person for the job or the person that should have done it. So it's, again, just another layer of the film that I think adds to its overall brilliance and enjoyment, frankly.
It's not glamorous, Right. It's not necessarily traditionally heroic like we think it is, Like it actually comes from the absolute, literally in this case, the bottom of society, literally the rock bottom of society. And that's where Malik begins his journey, right? He's really, and that's what's really hammered into our heads in the beginning. This guy is there is not a layer lower than where he is right now. Like he just doesn't, but that's actually where the prophets come from. And really, when you asked me, why did you pick this movie at the beginning of this podcast? I don't know if I was ready to answer that question until now, but that's really what speaks to me about this film. It shows you kind of the real weight of what a prophet goes through. The liberation in a sense of his own soul, the real liberation of it, that he's then able thus to then extend and liberate everyone, right? And it kind of speaks to that establishment of a soul of a people. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you really nailed it with that. I think that's probably a good jump off point. Actually, the liberation of the individual soul. That's what we're really talking about.
Yeah, this film shows you the stakes, and I think anybody can actually look at his struggle in a way and sort of examine their own life.
I feel very confident in telling people, like, watch this film, because not only are you going to watch an excellent crafted film with really amazing ideas, but there's actually a lot in it for you, the viewer, the individual. And so I'm just going to say it first. This was a great pick. Thank you for picking it. I feel like I mean that genuinely. Like the impact that the film had on me, I feel like I can offer you a thank you for picking it, because it was a great film and I'm better for watching it. So
well, I'm really blown away and happy that you enjoyed it. I wasn't sure, and I mean, I knew you would think it was a good, well-made film, because I just can't see how anyone would think this isn't a well-made film, But it's a very difficult film, and I have to say I had a really hard time with this one. You will be forgiven if you watch this film and you're like, okay, great, I learned my lessons in this movie. I don't want to go back into that environment,
Right. Well, luckily there's a place for those films.
The Authentic Cinema Podcast.
There you go. Well, thanks to everyone for listening to the episode. If you hopefully you're listening to this after having watched it, and we've enlightened a little bit about what we thought about the film and what the film has to offer. But as always, this is the Authentic Cinema Podcast. Stay tuned for more episodes to come, and thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot, Bob.
Mike, take care, man. Have a good one.
You too.